Okay, here we go. Welcome. I am Steve Stroh, NAGNJ, and I am the editor of the Zero Retries newsletter, which I'm going to tell you all about. And here are a few factoids about me. Um, Mostly data, as opposed to digital, as digital usually means digital voice these days. So I'm specific about doing data modes. Love to move. Well, the easiest way to explain it, my primary interest is that when I get a radio, first thing I think about is where do I plug in the modem? So that helps calibrate things. And mostly into VHF, UHF, because that's where you can do the high-speed data, and more interested in local stuff. Although I absolutely, now that I am in a great location and a nice big lot, there will be HF in the near future. Grew up in Ohio, wide open spaces, rural-ish, and moved to Seattle in '87, and now live in Bellingham, which is about 90 miles north of Seattle and about 60 miles south of Vancouver, British Columbia, which is the big city in this corner of the world. Um, I was just an average packet radio operator until I moved to Seattle, and I fell in with this bad crowd called what was called at various times the Wet Net Mafia. Wet Net was our informal name of the group. And they taught me amazing things. In fact, I got my first sysadmin job at Boeing because on the strength of what I had learned in amateur radio using TCP/IP over amateur radio, long before I ever touched it on the internet. I've been involved with Tapper at various points, being on the board of directors. I was briefly an editor for the Packet Status Register newsletter, and my wife and I ran a bunch of the digital communications conferences for about 5 years. Zero Retries was originally the newsletter of the Northwest Amateur Packet Radio Association, and after that organization went off the air, I always loved the name of the newsletter, and when I decided to do an amateur radio newsletter, Zero Retries was unclaimed, so I grabbed it with the blessing of the person who created that name. I've been on kind of a quiet campaign to try to get young techie amateur, or sometimes not so young techies, to get involved in amateur radio, and it is happening. It is absolutely happening. There is an amateur radio present at conferences like DEF CON, and that was actually one of the largest VE sessions. Like 200 plus people took the test at one time at DEF CON. But it's really hard to get them interested because they have this idea that keeps getting solidified by what I call the amateur radio and publishing industrial complex, and just popular perceptions in the media about what amateur radio is. What we can do in the modern era is a lot different than what that perception is. So I was getting frustrated at not being able to point them to, published articles and interesting things. Although it's gotten a little easier. Hackaday.com, the website, is just a fantastic advocate of amateur radio, because they treat amateur radio like just another part of techie fun, which I just love. But basically, good stuff. The stuff that I wanted to read, that I wanted to point others to, just wasn't getting written, and I was getting frustrated. I have written previously for amateur radio publications. My one article in 73 magazine about microcomputers and the Tapper PSR quite a bit. I was a CQ columnist for about 2 years, talking about digital, and I did a little bit professionally. And then I went on to have a couple of blogs that have kind of petered out because Zero Retries takes up an awful lot of my time. And I get asked a lot, well, why don't you try to explain things in QST? Well, The main reason is that I don't like that QST locks things away solely for the benefit of those who are ARRL members. And it just, for my purposes, I don't want my content locked away behind a paywall. So I just said, thank you, but no. And then, and this is the reason. I've actually been contacted by a fair number of people around the world who really appreciate the fact that Zero Retries is publicly accessible. There's none of the content has been paywalled. It won't be. I may do special things like compilations, but the base content is always going to be available as a payback for all of the wonderful things that amateur radio has done for me. And as an example of this is that 73 magazine, though it's not been published for 2 decades plus, probably 3 by now, is completely accessible on the web thanks to the Internet Archive and a gift of that publication by Wayne Green. But you can read all of it, but you can't say the same thing about QST or any of the other ARRL magazines, nor CQ, or even it makes sense to me that AMSAT would want to do the same thing, but nope, their content is paywalled also. Most of their content. So I was frustrated, but didn't know what to do until this new system called Substack came along, and it just made the whole thing easier. You basically just get to write, hit publish, and the system does the rest. For example, I've gotten about probably 20 new subscriptions in the last few days, and the system just handles it. They check you out, get you signed up, confirm that your email address is valid, all that stuff. I don't have to do any of that. I just watch the subscriber content grow. Substack does all the rest. It does. One of the best things about it is it creates an archival web page. With an RSS feed. It's basically a blog in the form of a blog. I could get started for free, and Substack makes their money by those who want to pay for a newsletter, but that's entirely an option for Zero Retries. It just helps offset some of the expenses that I incur, the overhead of publishing Zero Retries, the infrastructure. Zero Retries first published in July of 2021. It's now 150 plus issues later. I publish every week on Friday. I explained why it was Friday and why it was 3:30 Friday in a previous issue. And I basically discuss the cool stuff that I'm seeing that isn't otherwise getting written about. Again, it's free as in beer. No cost unless you choose to take out a paid subscription. The content is exactly the same at the moment. At this point, I now have over 1,650 subscribers, plus an awful lot of followers, in the hundreds, on various social media platforms. The 2 that I support at the moment are Blue Sky and Mastodon. And then there's also Substack is its own social media system, and I've got a number of people following me through that who aren't actually getting the newsletter via email. Again, I just try to showcase what's cool and interesting, and that I can make the case, and then I can go now with Zero Retries. I now have something to point people to in case if they do get interested in amateur radio. Here's some of the cool stuff, and it's searchable. It's not great. I'll explain that in a bit, but it's usable for now. And I try to explain that to young techies or techies that aren't otherwise knowledgeable about amateur radios, that you can go way, way beyond what you can do with the license exempt technologies like Bluetooth and Wi-Fi and LoRa, and even cellular. And kind of a subtle purpose for doing Zero Retries is I wanted to start showcasing the relevant stuff in case the FCC ever puts out a notice of inquiry and says, well, it's nice that amateur radio does all this quaint stuff, but we're not quite sure that it justifies holding on to as much spectrum as you have. What have you done for us lately? And every week I'm developing a solid record of what have we done lately. Some I've not just reporting necessarily. I've gotten kind of into the advocacy end of things at times. I am a very fervent advocate of the Digital Library of Amateur Radio and Communications, which is a project undertaken by the Internet Archive and funded by a grant from ARDC, Amateur Radio Digital Communications. That was a fairly big grant, but man, has it paid dividends, and we now have a real honest to God amateur radio library. One of the projects in that library is 73 magazine, but there's a heck of a lot more else. I think, I don't remember what the number is lately. It's well in excess of 700K individual items, some of which I've contributed. For example, I had the complete run of a publication called Packet Radio Magazine. I've never seen anybody else mention that publication online. It's the only time it ever has been mentioned was from Tapper, which published their newsletter briefly inside Packet Radio Magazine. So I contributed all of my issues of Packet Radio Magazine. They are now scanned and available to everyone worldwide in the DLARC section of Internet Archive. I'm a fan of Amateur Radio Digital Communications and for 2 years I was on their grants advisory committee, vetting the grants that came through. I am a very strong advocate of what they're doing. They are just improving amateur radio leaps and bounds by funding various projects. There was a couple of months ago, there was a conference call that was discussing the spectrum workforce, meaning that we need more radio expertise available in the US, and how do we build that? And there were 4 panelists, one of which was Phil Karn of ARDC. The other 3 wanted to say things about how to build up the spectrum workforce, and they danced right around amateur radio. But Phil, zeroed right in on things and said, well, we've got this group of people that, self-educate themselves. They don't need to be incentivized. They're playing with radio and self-educating on radio technology. They're called hams, or amateur radio operators. And you can see the other panelists kind of squirm, they're fancy, pricey advocacy programs were, kind of put to shame by the fact that hams exist. Let's see. Oh, I've been rabble-rousing about why the Western Hemisphere doesn't have an amateur radio geo satellite. And every time I periodically shake that tree, but haven't gotten any real satisfaction about why we don't and what's going on with that effort, if anything. It certainly doesn't seem like AMSAT is involved in this. Now, we may get one, at least for part of North America, through a project that's going to be funded by the European Space Agency. And it's because Canada is a member of the European Space Agency. So they want at least a few Canadian hams to get involved in the fun of putting up a geo satellite, probably over the Atlantic. Let's see. Oh, I've done a series of deep dives on various technologies. One that I really like is called VARA FM, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a few more slides. 25 kilobits per second over a standard 20 kilohertz channel with not much hardware and a pretty minimal investment in a software license. And this is in comparison to 9600 bits per second that we could never quite make work really well. And there were some reasons for that, but this new system called VARA FM just blows away, and it's getting an awful lot of traction in WinLink as a very powerful, very reliable system for doing WinLink communications in the local area. And lastly, the FCC has asked for comments about eliminating the possibility of eliminating symbol rates, and which they were pretty well committed to do for VHF and UHF. But should they eliminate bandwidth limits on VHF and UHF? And myself and a number of others, the ARRL and ARDC, all weighed in and said basically, yes, please eliminate the bandwidth limits on VHF and UHF and depend on good amateur practice, band plans, etc., and don't interfere. And various other, there were lots of other places in the amateur radio rules that would basically take care of that problem. Let's see. So I'm going to get into a few specifics about the kind of things I'm tracking. This is not an exhaustive list. It's just it's indicative of some of the things that I try to cover in zero retries that aren't being reported elsewhere, or at least not being reported very well. So new packet radio, and I apologize in advance, there are no pictures. This was a kind of a bare bones presentation, and I live with this stuff, so the picture is very clearly on my mind, and I should give you the benefit of the doubt of pictures for these, but apologies. New packet radio has despite the name, has no resemblance to classic packet radio, amateur packet radio. It's data only, and it operates at the moment solely in the 70 centimeter band. It is open source hardware. Every bit of it is available in specifications. There are now two the original one was fairly low power. You had to use an outboard amp that was designed for digital mobile radio, DMR, because it is a TDMA system. So the amp has to have fast turnaround from transmit to receive. And so it got a little expensive and a little clunky. A new unit from Germany has an integrated 7-watt power amplifier, so that works a lot better, and those are getting into circulation. There's a group in Finland that's trying to do the same thing, only they're going to use a big power brick from, I think, Motorola, that'll put out as much as 50 watts. So the trick is, at least here in the US, is you need to be able to use a 1 megahertz channel to do 1 megabit per second. At the moment, the FCC rules limit you to a 100 kilohertz channel and 56 kilobits per second, regardless of the size of the channel. So that's indicative of the kind of things that were being hamstrung with the arcane FCC rules currently in place for bandwidth limit and data rate. VARA FM, which I talked about a few minutes ago, it's implemented entirely as software running on a Windows PC. If you have good equipment, a good modem, and a good radio that basically get the pre-emphasis and de-emphasis stages in the radio out of the way, the 9600 baud connection, then it will run at its full potential of 25 kilobits per second. It's just really amazing. And the way that it does this is it implements a whole bunch of techniques that are overlaid. One of the coolest ones is that if you don't have a radio that is capable of running at the max speed, you can still use any amateur radio using the microphone and speaker jacks and careful adjustment of the audio levels. It will run at about half its maximum speed, 12 kilobits per second. But each VARA FM unit will handshake with the one you're trying to connect to, and it'll establish a maximum common speed and then just go. And that is just amazing. You can share the channel. Unlike being able to share a packet radio channel between 1200 and 9600 baud users, this not only can share the channel, every station can interoperate. That's a really powerful capability that we haven't had before. Okay, K9Q radio. This is another new project. Basically, Phil Karn is a genius, literally, and he has figured out how to do simultaneous monitoring of all VHF, UHF repeater channels in a band using one software-defined receiver and one computer. Um, and it's purely a software implementation. He thought of a very interesting way to make this work. And one of the things that you can just is this the typical example is he said that he runs around San Diego with the radio in his car, and he can hear almost all of the Papa repeaters in the San Diego area, but not equally well. And he could be using this system. And again, it runs on a computer that you could easily power from a car, you know, a Raspberry Pi 4 or 5. He could with a little bit more software, it doesn't do this right now, but he could vote on the repeater that he wants to monitor second by second, because it can hear all of those channels simultaneously. It's just an amazing project, and it's just getting started. And it basically is it's getting a lot of traction now for HF monitoring, because it can, and it's a saner way to do it than a lot of these web receivers have been doing it to date. DigiPi, this is another cool project. Basically, it's all of the amateur radio modes that you can implement in Linux in one package that runs on a little brick that you put on the corner, and then it proxies it out. You don't have to have a screen, keyboard, or mouse attached to the unit itself. It's just the DigiPi, the radio, sitting in the corner. It's being proxied out onto your local area network, not through the internet, just your wireless LAN, or even, I suppose you could connect it via Ethernet, but you don't need to. Then you can sit on the couch with your web browser tablet or a laptop, or even your phone, and operate digital modes from the web browser, which is really cool. It's pretty minimal hardware. Most of the magic is done in software. And now there are at least two plug and play implementations of what little hardware you do need, which is the sound card and a little display and a little bit of circuitry for the push to talk. M17 is another interesting project. And again, the theme of Zero Retries is to highlight the projects that aren't being otherwise mentioned much, or especially in detail. So I try and follow these projects not fantastically closely, because I cast a very wide net, but I do try to keep up with the developments in these projects when there are major developments, and report it out. And it's really impressive how many people have told me that they had no idea about some of these projects that I report in Zero Retries. So M17 is a project to develop a equivalent, essentially, to DMR, the hardware, the software, the protocols, the networking, and I hope that they do they implement messaging cleanly, so that you can send at least text messages, if not actual data, do file transfers. So a couple of developments have fallen out of this. The main developer of M17 is developing a unit called the Remote Radio Unit, which is essentially a tower, complete with duplexer. All the hardware lives on the tower right underneath the antenna. And then the data comes down the tower on fiber. Some power goes up the tower, not much. It's amazingly efficient. And it's kind of like a ICOM 905, only it's a repeater instead of, a user radio. Another project is OpenHT, which is a more developed version of a project that was abandoned a couple of years ago. This is a true software-defined transceiver that's handheld, complete with the radio, a display, a keyboard, and audio in. It's an amazing project. These are just projects at the moment. They are not products. They're not usable at the moment as even if you had the chops to build it yourself. They're not ready to go. They've just basically been proofs of concept so far. Connect Systems of DMR fame is now developing a pair of amateur radio, portable radios that will come out of the box working with M17. So their M17 is really getting some traction. There's at least one repeater in California that now has M17 as one of its supported digital voice modes, and M17 is supported in the MMDVM specification. I'll explain a little bit about that in a second. Arden, Amateur Radio Emergency Data Network. This is firmware based on the Open WRT work that is designed for amateur radio microwave mesh networking. You flash various units. They have a complete list of the units that their firmware does support on their website. It's pretty clean. It works very well. The meshing finally works cleanly. It scales. There's some tricks that you can use. One is called, I think, a supernode. And it is implemented specifically for amateur radio. It keeps it simple. You don't have to worry about DNS, DHCP, which IP address to use. It basically figures all that out for itself within the network. Excuse me just a second. It puts your call sign in the header. It does not support any kind of encryption per the amateur radio rules. And there are at least a few chunks of microwave spectrum at 2.3 gigahertz and 5.9 gigahertz that are amateur radio exclusive, and it retunes the radios to support those chunks of spectrum. You guys got to see a presentation about cats. I'm mentioning it here just kind of as completeness. I'm a big fan of this project. I bought some of the hardware, haven't unfortunately turned it on yet, but he's got it really dialed in. He really put a lot of thought into that, and he wasn't afraid to start from scratch doing it himself. And I just love that people are still tackling big projects like this, and, not daunted by, the what factor in amateur radio. Here's a note about MMDVM TNC, multi-mode digital voice modem. And most people know, if they know of MDVM, they know it as a hotspot that is in their radio or their vehicle that lets you connect your portable radio or your mobile radio via radio to this little hotspot, which then proxies out onto the internet and connects to various networks. That is certainly a part of MMDVM, but I was surprised. I heard from the developer that he developed MMDVM originally so that amateur radio could get back into the repeater business after having to buy proprietary repeaters like D-Star repeaters from ICOM, like DMR repeaters from Motorola and Hytera, and System Fusion repeaters from Yaesu, et cetera, P25 repeaters, et cetera. MMDVM implements all of those modes in one little piece of hardware that you can embed in the center of a FM repeater, and then all of a sudden that repeater can do all those voice modes, digital voice modes, and more, including paging and a data mode, which I'll talk about. So the data mode is called MMDVM TNC, and it's still in development, but it's going to be just another mode in an MMDVM system. It's already supported in all of the MMDVM hardware. So we get to do, we've learned our lesson about how to do data poorly or within the paradigms that we had available at the time. Now we can do 9600 using the G3 RUH modulation, which is the one that they started using in the satellite programs. That was a really solid implementation of 9600, and uses built-in forward error correction, and it will scale up to at least 19200 bits per second and potentially 38400 bits per second. Again, still in development, but it's the potential is awesome, and that's why I cover it in Zero Retries. 44net virtual private network. 44net is a block of 12 million IPv4 addresses that are available for use in amateur radio. They are static addresses. They can be made routable on the internet. And this is a way for somebody like me, who is not a networking guru, to be able to have a small router with backed up with a block of IPv4 addresses from 44net, to tunnel through the internet, my standard internet connection, Starlink in my case, um, to the internet, and then come out on the other end as static routable IP addresses. So for example, one of the ways I want to use my 44net addresses is to get a bunch of systems on the air here in my shop, talking within the shop, and then giving remote access to those for any developers that might want to try out a heterogeneous network consisting of all kinds of different modems and all kinds of different radios on the same channel, all trying to do things like 9600 or faster modes. And this is only available to amateur radio operators or potentially research partners, but definitely not for profit, and not for commercial use. And it's not a substitute for the internet or standard internet access. Modern packet radio is going great guns, well beyond WinLink and APRS. There are still a number of networks operating in the US and overseas. And it's being very well supported by a number of pieces of hardware, probably many of which you haven't heard of. Direwolf is kind of the secret sauce of making amateur radio great again, or sorry, making packet radio great again, because man, it just does so many different things that you could never do in a hardware TNC. There is a hardware TNC called the Nino TNC that's relatively inexpensive. It's about $100 or less than $100 if you buy all the pieces, parts, and assemble it yourself. You can also buy an assembled and tested version that is really well done. There's one called the TNC4. JNOS is a router that does both internet TCP/IP and standard amateur radio networking, like we used to do with NetROM. I think it also includes a small BBS. But BPQ32 is a full stack of all of that, plus a very well-supported BBS that is still in development. All that stuff is still in development. Just amazing stuff. One of the things I've been tracking is all the potential for all these amazing new modes using software-defined radios, not just receivers, but transmitters. And we've had software-defined transceivers for quite a while, some of which are very reasonably priced, like the ADALM Pluto by Analog Devices, which they continue to make and sell for this reasonable price of $232 retail, quantity one, because that's the standard way you teach someone in an electrical engineering program in college how to build your own radio technology using software. But they only, because they're powered by USB, they don't have a big power budget, so their transmitter output is only about 10 milliwatts. So the trick is, how do you get from 10 milliwatts to say 2 watts so that you can use power amplifiers that were designed for, among other things, portable radios? So I finally found an amplifier that will actually work for this purpose, that was intended for amateur radio television gear, by a guy named, I've forgotten his name now, KH6HTV. This sucker will take that 10 milliwatts and put out as much as 70 watts. It's an amazing amplifier. Very, very, very cool. And so that's another one of my projects for this summer. Amateur radio adjacent. I don't limit zero retries to just looking at amateur radio things. Meshtastic is getting an awful lot of press because it's just popular, because you can play with it, no amateur radio license required, because it operates here in the US in the 902 to 928 license exempt band, which amateur radio shares. We don't get to do anything other than, use our full privileges in amateur radio, including more power. But folks are having a great time with Meshtastic, and I didn't quite know what to make of Meshtastic until I read this really good description that said um, Meshtastic is kind of a gateway drug for amateur radio. So I'm going to get involved in Meshtastic and put a relay note on the air and start talking to the locals and saying, well, yeah, that's fun, but amateur radio, wow, you could do a lot more. Ribbit and Rattlegram are a project that's still in development, and this is open source, and it's a really interesting idea that you have a data communication system that doesn't physically connect to a radio. So you basically, when you want to exchange data, the radio is when the radio uh, receives a data signal, it comes out over the speaker and the phone is in listening mode. And then when you want to transmit, you compose your message on the phone, you push the push to talk, and then the phone starts sending audio tones. It's all acoustically coupled. You wouldn't think it would work all that well. It works amazingly well. And again, this is license exempt. You can use any kind of radio, FRS, GMRS. I know it's not permitted, but it is being done. SatNOGs, Satellite Network Open Ground System. This is a set of plans for you to build your own ground station for receiving data from research satellites. And the complete plans are there, including a fair amount of parts that you can either buy off the shelf or make with a 3D printer. And it's the ultimate way to do this is you have a tracking antenna that says, oh, I'm gonna be in the footprint of a research satellite that they would really like to get the data from. So your system wakes up, figures out where to point the antenna, and then downloads, locally processes, and then uploads via the internet. It's a really cool thing. And again, this no license required because it's receive only. I get it sometimes accused of dissing conventional amateur radio, which it's not quite accurate. I don't talk about conventional amateur radio much, just because I don't need to. There's plenty of people that are doing that. That's their way of advocating amateur radio. I just don't think the conventional things that we used to do are that interesting to this new generation, especially to techies. They need to be told about things like microwave networking via Arden. That will get them interested because they do that kind of stuff in their day job, with Wi-Fi, deploying Wi-Fi or managing Wi-Fi. So they understand microwave networking. They just have never been able to do it outdoors at scale. So if you tell them about Arden, building an Arden network, they say, oh, that sounds like fun. We actually get to put hardware on towers and, do long links and figure out problems, in a big network, distributed. So that's my emphasis is on the techie things to get the techies interested, because as everybody knows, we got to get more bodies in the door. Let's see. I talked more about VHF and UHF because that's, a lot more compatible with younger folks being in dorms or condos or apartments. A lot of the projects that you can experiment with or understand, that live mostly in the software realm, software-defined radios are a perfect example. And then space, because who doesn't love telling techies about space? The amateur radio station on the International Space Station. The astronauts talk to kids via amateur radio, and of course, bouncing signals off the moon. What's not to like? Future projects is not going to be just a newsletter. These are all spinouts that I had never imagined until I've now been publishing Zero Retries almost 3 years now, and these kind of things kind of leapt out at me as needing to be done. There needs to be a book because people don't want to scroll back through 3 years of Zero Retries to find a mention about project X, Y, or Z. So if they can look up in a book, chapter 33 is about new packet radio, then they can go right to it. It's kind of like the ARRL handbook. Video is, you know, the least popular YouTube channel that I follow has like 13,000 subscribers, and I'm barely hitting 1,600 in zero retries. So video is clearly the medium of this era. And another thing that fell out of some recent work I've done is that there's so many interesting projects and products and companies out there that are doing interesting things, but they're not, it's really hard to find them unless you know where to look. So there needs to be some kind of a catalog like a Wikipedia, like a wiki or a web page or something, a directory of where to find all these cool things. And I did something similar to that, but it wasn't very well organized. And I didn't really, it was at least a start, but I didn't know what I was quite needing to do. And I know that now. It's not a urgent project, and it doesn't need to be done by me. But if nobody else does it, it's one of the things that I'm going to tackle in the future. And Zero Retries is published every Friday, 15:30 Pacific, via email. It's free as in beer, but you can, if you would like to support me and help offset some of my expenses, that's welcome. But again, the content is entirely free and accessible to anyone in the world. And at zeroretries.org. And that is my presentation.
Wow, very good. Thank you
So
very
I'm
much, Steve. Let's see, Barry, what do we have in chat in the way of questions?
We don't have anything right now in chat. Quiet.
Okay.
Everybody has been in rapt attention.
All
We
right.
do have a
We
couple
got
of
some
hands.
hands up. So let's go
Yep.
ahead and start with Rich, Echo Golf Delta.
Thanks very much. That was a fascinating presentation, and congratulations on your communications project. I Googled prior to the presentation zeroretries.org, and one of the subheadings that came up was podcast. And I'm an avid amateur radio podcast listener, and I'm wondering if a podcast does exist, and if so, if it's accessible with an RSS feed. Thank you.
Yes, I did experiment with podcasting as part of the Substack platform, and Substack does support podcasts. I just kind of ran out of bandwidth to do a podcast and zero retries. Zero retries has kind of taken over a big chunk of my life lately, and as I've gotten more ambitious with it, there is definitely a podcast in the future of some kind. I did a test with a fellow fan, and I'm not I don't have any details to announce for that, but yeah, the podcasting is fun. It's a completely different feel. So yes, look for it, but not at the moment. There are some that you can, if you go on that link there, you'll see the couple of test podcasts that I did, but nothing current at the moment. But
In your
look
next
forward.
life.
No, I've slowly gotten zero retries dialed in where it's taking less and less time to get it done. So, as I get more efficient, especially, and there's, for example, one of the things that is playing to my particular requirements is that there are now audio editors that will do an automatic transcription of the podcast, and then you can edit it and you can edit the podcast in text, which appeals to me greatly.
Oh yeah.
So that would speed things up a lot.
Okay, great. Thank you. Let's go to Gene.
Yeah, good evening, everybody. This is Gene in Texas. It's interesting information. I've been taking notes throughout the entire night of this Zoom meeting. This technology, the physical or the software side, could this also be used outside of the country, let's say in Europe, or do they have different laws concerning operating this type of way for amateur radio operators, or some of the stuff that you don't need a license for? Do you know?
Yes, there are a number of the units that I talked, or the technologies that I talked about. For example, new packet radio, everywhere else outside the US, that full 1 megabit per second capability is completely legal because they don't have the arcane bandwidth limits that we have. They just don't make the distinction of 100 kilohertz maximum channel size or the data rate limitations. So in Europe, where new packet radio was developed originally, yeah, they can run networks at 1 megabit per second all day long. We're constrained to a paltry, by comparison, 56 kilobits per second maximum. So as soon as the FCC decides to relax those two requirements, those two limitations, boom, you can just switch your new packet radio to fastest mode and be on the air. So
yeah. And Gene, that's kind of consistent with other aspects of amateur radio regulation. The US and Japan are really the only countries where the amateur radio regulations tell you what you can do where. Most of the others just say it's yours, use it, don't screw it up. And obviously some countries have limitations, either in frequency limitations, but in terms of how you use them, the ones that you are authorized to use, it's pretty open in most other countries.
One interesting thing that was brought up to the FCC, and it was done very elegantly by the ARDC filing, was pointing out that if you do a digital transmission that you are sending images, that's completely legal to use up, whatever bandwidth you wish, because images are not restricted. That was to accommodate amateur television, which required back in the day a 6 megahertz channel. So that exact same transmission that you're going to send arbitrary data, that immediately gets throttled back to 56 kilobits per second, maximum 100 kilohertz channel for data. But if you call it image transmission, no problem. Have at it.
Very good. Steve, I'm wondering, a lot of what you're describing, and your publication there seems like a super outreach effort, particularly for young folks. Is there anything that might be incorporated into the ARRL's Teachers Institute, which is basically providing teachers with material that they can use to get young folks excited in school about STEM?
I would welcome that, that kind of a contribution. My intent is, I only slap a copyright notice on my publication to have some recourse if some nasty person decides to start pirating my content, and calling it theirs. So other than that, no, everything in Zero Retries is a love letter to amateur radio, and to help pay back amateur radio for all that I've gotten over the decades. So no, I would love for it to be used. In fact, some of the writing, I was actually asked to contribute to oops. There it is. 100th ARRL handbook. Still in the shrink wrap. So there's a little bit of Zero Retries in this. I believe it was the RDOP section, or it was the data. It was talking about specific data modes.
Well, very good. So some of the things you mentioned in your presentation, such as Ribbit and of course VARA FM, we've had whole presentations on that on RATPAC in the past, and they've all been very popular. So this is another opportunity for our viewers, both the ones that are here and the many that look at it on YouTube, to find cool stuff to pursue.
I just love that there are things like Ribbit that let people get a little bit of appreciation for doing data modes outside of amateur radio without the necessity. I wouldn't call Ribbit a gateway drug. It's not quite that compelling as much as Meshtastic is, but it certainly gets you familiar with what the idea is about data communications over radio instead of Wi-Fi or cellular.
Now we have to be kind of careful where we push this because, you know, I mean, when you look at the Part 95 rules for things like FRS, you know, you don't have, you know, data that you can actually run through there generally. So, you know, we don't want to encourage people to be breaking the rules, but
As far as I'm concerned, you haven't made a radio that would do data communications. You are happen to be pushing some data communications over, and there is incidental data communications permitted over FRS. I'm not sure about GMRS,
if it's
but
like position, locate position and stuff like that, yeah.
who's to
Uh,
say that the data that's going over Ribbit isn't position data? I mean, I
yeah.
it,
All I'm saying is we, you know, we pride ourselves as amateurs on, you know, doing what the best we can within the constraints of the rules and then trying to change the rules, where they are being unreasonable. But at the same time, you know, since we're talking often to the public and we're perceived as the experts in radio communication, you know, I don't want to encourage them to do things that would directly contravene the rules under which, you know, that apply to the radios they're using.
yep. Well, here's a I'm generally a ask for forgiveness rather than permission kind of person on this sort of thing. But one of the things that tipped me over the edge on the way my advocacy of things like Ribbit is that we desperately in this country need more folks that have radio technology expertise. We have got to grow our pool of radio. We live in a wireless society now. We can't go back. You know, the idea that we could fall back to landlines, that's dead. You know, we live and literally sometimes die on the strength of our radio technology now. We've got to be able to do really good cellular. We've got to be able to do really good satellite, you know. So we need more people to do that. And getting people hooked on doing radio technology experimentation like this is, in my opinion, the greater good than nitpicking
Yeah.
about
Well, I
whether or
mean,
not.
as a practical matter, the FCC doesn't spend much of any time on enforcement anyway.
True. Yeah, this is true.
I mean, even less than we would like them to, in fact.
But I just can't see I just can't see the harm in, you know, a couple of kids with FRS radios, you know, in a neighborhood exchanging texts back and forth using Ribbit. I mean, it's all open source technology. It's not if memory serves, it's not encrypted, at least by default. So, you know, you can be listening to it, monitoring it, you know, so make sure no nuclear codes are being exchanged, etc.
Okay, Gene, you have your hand up again. Go ahead. Other questions for Steve? All right, Steve, thank you again so much. You provided a great resource for us and for the amateur community and for the non-amateur community. So please keep up the great work, and we'll be steering people your way.
And I continue to steer people your way. I just love the RATPAC presentations, and I'm usually one that enjoys watching it on YouTube later, and instead of, you know, trying
That's
to show.
fine.
Yeah, and and they're great. And I love that there's the mix, and the ones that are cool and techie. My terminology is zero retries interesting. So I will thanks again for putting out zero retries interesting content.
All right. Well, thank you for being here. Thank you, everybody, and have a great evening. And